Peace and love. This video was me closing the door on a rather antiquated argument that I've been combating for the last 3 years, which is the Hebrew Israelite argument of the black Portuguese Jews, and the idea that physical and phenotypical descriptions of them prove that they are quote-unquote black, specifically in the sense of black that pertains to sub-Saharan Africans and the African diaspora, based on the usage of certain words like black, dark, or swarthy. The major issue with this argument is that they're making a lineage claim of being Hebrews, but basing it off of descriptions of color and physical appearance. Morphology, color, or phenotype is insufficient to determine one's genetics and produces false positives. Even if they were granted their interpretation of these old sources they use for skin color and morphological features, it doesn't prove lineage. So descriptions are useless. A testable, repeatable method, such as DNA testing the Y chromosome, would be sufficient to tell people apart. So they pretty much have an idea that there's two classes of Jews. They will acknowledge white Portuguese Jews or fair-skinned Portuguese Jews, but they tend to favor the black ones as being the true Jews, as being the true lineal descendants. And don't get anything messed up or confused. There are actually black people who are Portuguese Jews, and it's documented that descendancy came from intermarriage between black people and Iberian people, producing children, and also through conversion in the Iberian Peninsula. But proponents of this argument make it so that the blacks were the true ones the whole time when they were exiled into Portugal, and the white ones, they were either converts or fakes or something like that. So they use this based on, one, their presupposition that the original Jews were black the whole time, based on their interpretation of scripture, and two, their presupposition based on morphological and color descriptions, based on like ancient or early modern sources like Tacitus mentioning Ethiopia, or any source that might mention the usage describing them as black, dark, or swarthy. Now, a typical color argument for Portuguese Jews would be Baruch Spinoza. Right here, he's described in this 1706 source on page 39 as having somewhat black skin. Now, proponents of the literal black Portuguese Jew argument will take the usage of black as literal, despite depictions in portraits during his lifetime showing otherwise. The only response they really give is an appeal to conspiracy, like whitewashing. But Spinoza was alive when these images were made. So again, the note, skin color does not prove lineage. And usage of words like black and swarthy, yes, they definitely pertain to literal black people, or quote-unquote black people African descent, but they were also used on people who weren't. Spinoza is an example, and I covered this in my video on modern Jews from the 18th to the 20th century. The methodology for this argument employs the false equivalence fallacy. So if I were to give a description of color and morphology for popular figures such as Martin Luther King, Marcus Garvey, and even my favorite rapper Nas, and I describe them at any time as black or Negro, etc., this would suffice those who would support this kind of argument. However, while they're making a lineage claim, and they're making a lineage claim about an ethnic group, one would need to do further research, and then they would discover that all three of these men have the appearance of modern black men, but in fact descend from Europeans. Now, while the majority of African Americans belong to clades of EM2 or E1B1A, Dr. King is said to have had Irish paternal ancestry, while Marcus Garvey's line is said to go back to Spain and Portugal. And to reference the book Finding Your Roots, page 228 to 229, Nas is said to have the Viking clade, haplogroup I. So if you do any real research or true investigation into lineage to find out who you are, you'll find that reading in the old sources about morphology would be just obsolete. It won't lead you anywhere but to false positives. You'll be worried about how somebody looks, and you're not worried about who they actually descend from. Another interesting example I have regarding lineage versus morphology. This is a 23andMe result showing a man of mixed ancestry. He's 84% European, 12% Asian, indigenous and less than 1% African, who most likely has the appearance closely approaching a white man in America, or just certainly not a black person. Nobody you would just say is, black by today's standards. However, his paternal lineage, EZ5994, descends from EM2 or E1B1A. The African diaspora also shares lineages that come out of EM2, downgrades of E1B1A. So despite the actual African lineage of this individual, sources 200 years ago would have probably looked at his genetic makeup being 84% European. They would just call him a regular white man based on descriptions. You'd never know his paternal origin. You'd never know that he descended from a black man if he didn't know, if he didn't say anything. So this is another reason why just morphological arguments or descriptions doesn't mean anything. You can have one white parent, right? You can take somebody like Rick Kittles, or take someone who had a white ancestor, and over time, if they keep procreating with people of color, African Americans, or just anybody like Indians or something like that, they'll have the look of the current race that they've mixed with, but their lineage would go back to a totally other people. So back to their presuppositions. So one of them is the original Jews were black based on interpretation of scripture. Well, we know scriptural interpretation can be put up against everybody else's interpretation, so at least you know where, right? And morphological descriptions, one of them they use is Tacitus, right? Or they use any source from the 1800s or 1700s saying black, dark, or swarthy. What they're not factoring in is that fair skin and blue eyes have been detected in Israel 6,500 years ago during the Chalcolithic period. So it's not impossible for anyone during the biblical time period or before to have traits seen in modern Levantine populations. Blue eyes, or colored eyes, dark curly hair, fair skin to brown skin to even dark skin, right? We know brown skin populations was present. The ancient synagogue in Dura Europos shows fair and dark skinned Jews, and this is where I believe anywhere between the 2nd to the 4th century AD. And then you have I believe a 6th century synagogue in Israel that shows brown Jews. So again, it doesn't prove lineage, just to show how somebody look. I mean, I've seen a source Hebrew used that talk about in the late 1800s how modern Palestinians and Arabs were brown skinned. So when we see early modern usage of black, dark, or swarthy, not only is it irrelevant, but it can apply to people that aren't even black. Jack Forbes details this in his book. I'm gonna put the source right here on the screen. Y'all can catch that. So I've dealt with this before in one of my videos, right? I've dealt with this. Several individuals like Walt Whitman, Al Capone, Louis Prima, Joe Pepitone, Jews in Poland, Mexicans, Laplanders, Germans, Italians, French people, Russians. They've all been called dark, black, or swarthy. Several of my videos detail this. I recommend them to you. I recommend you actually check them out. I got one where Benjamin Franklin was calling Europeans swarthy and dark. I've got one talking about modern Jews and Italians. Even the non-Jewish Iberians, the non-Jewish people of Spain and Portugal, were called dark, right? And another source states that despite their shade, their features vary very little from non-Jewish Iberians, meaning regardless of their skin tones, they pretty much shared a similar look, similar features. Medieval Haggada's that I've brought out and showed. You can see some swarthy skinned Sephardic Jews, but they certainly still share the features of the regular population of Iberians, regular people of Portugal and Spain. And here's a source from 1760 where the Jews are explicitly mentioned alongside actual Negroes, quote unquote, or African black people, quote unquote, and they are called swarthy, while the Negroes are called black or jet black. So there is a contrast. The Jews here are mentioned with actual quote unquote black people, and they are not called Negroes, but the Negroes are called Negroes, and they're treated as separate. I talked about this in a video where I contrasted swarthiness of the Jews and Africans. Y'all should check that out. Then we come to the Jews in Great Britain or England, and in Jonathan Schorsch's book on page 180, I believe, this is in the digital edition, he puts together about 3 of the sources and claims that Hebrews like to use in England. So it talks about William Brereton visiting the synagogue in Amsterdam and him saying that the Jews were most black. And then you have another fella named John Greenhalgh who went to a synagogue in London and described the chief ruler as big, black and fierce. And then you have him at the end of his letter saying the Jews are generally black, so to be distinguished from Spaniards or native Greeks, because their hair have a deeper tincture of a more perfect raven black. And then lastly you have a Robert Kirk who visited a synagogue, and then he says, oh, they were all very black men and indistinct in their reasoning as gypsies. And you know, like the second one where he talks about the hair, sometimes in England or in certain places, people who were brunettes, that was a description that they would call them. You're a black man because you got black hair. You're a brown man with brown hair. So here's a 1733 source relating to England and their usage of words. We come to page 25 to 26. We see Daniel, Earl of Nottingham mentioned, and his description has him as a tall, thin, very black man, like a Spaniard or Jew, 50 years old. So is he literally black? Well, during his lifetime he was painted, and he's not literally a black man. He does have black hair or a black wig, because I believe that was a wig. I mean, they have another painting of him just straight up bald head, so that probably was a wig. So when we see these descriptions of people, especially in England where they use a lot of color regarding your hair color, and they're described as black, but they're never explicitly called Negroes. You notice that. It's not always literal. You can look up images of these people contemporary to the time that they were alive. Everything's not a conspiracy. A lot of the people who make these arguments usually appeal to that without proof. But yeah, no, not literally a black person. That's the thing about history. The way words were used, you can't always expect those usages to carry through time the same way. But yeah, those people were never explicitly called Negroes. A lot of them were just called black because of the color of their hair. So in regards to Jews in England, I touched on it somewhat and briefly in this video that I'm showing here on the screen. Here's one of the sources used for the Black Portuguese argument. This is from 1883, and we go on to page 118, and it's talking about the color of Portuguese Jews compared to the Beja or the Bikari tribe from Africa. So it says, thus the black color is found not only in individuals as the black Jews of Portugal, but in tribes as the Bikari on the Red Sea. So the term black Jews of Portugal separates them from non-black Sephardim. But besides outward appearance, what separates them genetically? How did the black or the white Jews come about? This source tells you nothing about their lineage. It just compares the skin tone of individuals, black Portuguese Jews, with Bikari. So it doesn't tell you which one they think is real or not. This is just a passing mention. We know black Jews exist. We're going to see, in Portugal that they do exist. So it's not a big deal, really. But this is the Beja or the Bikari tribe that they're compared to. And when it comes to calling people black Portuguese or the black Portuguese Jews or being the black version of anything, that's contrasting it with being the white or the non-black version of it. And so Cape Verdeans had to be designated as such. They're referred to as the black Portuguese juxtaposed to white Portuguese. Despite this, they are partially descendants of Portuguese Jews, Africans, and regular Portuguese people. So it's possible that the black Jews of Portugal can have a similar origin, because they doing something similar in Cape Verde, right? These are Cape Verdeans. They're mixed people off the coast of Africa. And when you look at their DNA, we see that 53.5% of them cluster in haplogroups I, J, K, and R1, which is European and Middle Eastern paternal lineages. And we see that they have 20.5% of E3b M81, indicates possible gene flow from the Middle East or Northeast Africa, which at least partly could be ascribed to Sephardic Jews. And they have 15.9% E1b1a in this study. So Cape Verdean DNA suggests the legacy of Sephardic Jews. They're called the Black Portuguese. They have DNA that goes back to the Middle East and likely Sephardic Jews. So we can't see mixture as an option to produce Black Portuguese. Then these are Iberian Jews. Well, this man is an Iberian Jew. This is his wife. They mixed with blacks and black slaves in Suriname. And his descendants would be called Black Portuguese, or if they practice Jewish faith, these would be Black Portuguese Jews. Same thing they did outside of Portugal. Same thing they did outside of Portugal, they did in Portugal. We're going to see. Here's a source from 1790. This is before the 1883 source that we're criticizing. This is by Neville Wyndham. We're going to page 290 to 291. It's going to talk about Africans in Portugal. Africans who were imported from the 1400s. Other than the Moors who came in 7th, 8th century, these are the black populations in Iberia. So it talks about Africans, natives of Africa. Many were born of African parents either in Portugal or as ultramarine dominions. They are allowed to marry not only among themselves but also with those of a different color. It talks about black and a white producing mulattoes joining with a black or a white. And it talks about mestizos, and it talks about them joining with mestizos blacks or true whites. So it's a lot of mixture going on. Then we have right here, to all these mongrel mixtures you may add the Jewish. So the Jews of Portugal, because this takes place in Portugal, they're mixing with the regular Portuguese who are mixing with black Africans. So it's a lot of mixture going on with the Jews mixing with them. It says they have Jews who personate Christians and often intermarry both with the white and the other generations. So now when we talk about some 80 years later or less than 100 years later, Black Portuguese, we see that Jews were actually mixing with black people in the regular Portuguese. And it says right here, not a drop of pure Portuguese blood will be left here, but all will be corrupted between Jews and Negroes. So they're mentioned separately. Actually, if the Black Portuguese Jews were like a pure caste of people, they would have been explicitly mentioned here, because we know the Negroes, if you read this source, you'll see the Negroes are actual Africans imported. Other than Moors who've been there for 700-800 years, the Jews right here are separate from Negroes. They're not one and the same here, regardless of how they're described in some sources as tan, olive, swarthy. There's a separation here. So they're mixing in Portugal. This is a source that's older than the one we're criticizing. So we already see that this is a possibility that those people could be descendants of miscegenation or mixing or intermarriage. But conversion as a means to produce black Jews can also be an option. So Alan H. Garvey in his book The Lost Tribes of Myth on page 247, he mentions Moors, which, you know, includes a large part of Africans, Northwest Africans, Sub-Saharan Africans, because we know they're present. Talks about them being converted in Iberia. The idea of conversion is a possibility and should be factored into these arguments. Then in this article here by Jonathan Schorsch, he talks about Sephardic Jews who went to Amsterdam, right? And they took the African slaves, and the slaves were occasionally converted to Judaism. Right here, congregants were accustomed to proselytizing their African servants. And it says, as long as these slaves became Jews at the end of their services. So, yeah, there definitely were cases of proselytizing into conversion. And this happened not only outside of Portugal, but in Portugal. So coming back to summarize the source, acknowledging two groups of Sephardim, white and black, the black ones could be the result of various options. They actually are of a separate stock, but we have no way of actually testing that because we don't have no genetic testing on these people in the 1800s. We just have the mere mention of them. But we do have two other options that are very much likely the case of how you could get that, and conversion, which is documented, and number 3, dark descendants whose ancestors were originally mixed, like Lanzados, Surinamese Jews, and Cape Verdeans. This source doesn't explicitly endorse any of these options. It only states that there are black Sephardim and says nothing about their lineage. So when you're trying to prove who you are, you can't just show, well, there's black Portuguese that exist. You have to prove an actual connection to them, because they could be converts. They could be the children of non-black people who just kept mixing with more black people over time, and they exist as they are. So this wouldn't be real proof for any of their claims. So the source on your screen is another source used to make the black Portuguese Jew argument, and this is page 289 of the source, actually the bottom of page 288. It talks about the Jews being expelled from Portugal, and this is taking place in India. So when we go to 289, this is the actual center of the argument right here. It says, many Arabs of pure blood in the middle of Africa are as black as Negroes. The Jews of Portugal and of Cochin are very black, though they do not intermarry with natives. So their argument is that because Portuguese Jews and even the Cochin Jews are described here as very black, and that they don't intermix with native Indians, that they are a pure caste of black Jews. This is where DNA clears things up. So when we go to the just a simple wiki search on Cochin Jews, Jews of Cochin, you can just go down to genetic analysis, and we can just immediately debunk and dispel the claim from that 19th century source that they didn't intermix with anybody, because looking in the genetics of the Cochin Jews, it says they maintain a range of 3 to 20% Middle Eastern ancestry. So they confirmed the traditional narrative of migration from the Middle East to India. But the test noted, however, that the community had considerable Indian admixture, exhibiting the fact that the Indian Jewish people inherited their ancestry from Middle Eastern and Indian population. So they did mix. Study the genetic history of Cochin Jews of India. It says, we find that, as reported by several previous studies, the genetics of Cochin Jews resemble that of local Indian populations. However, we identify considerable Jewish genetic ancestry that is not present in any other Indian or Pakistani populations. Combined, Cochin Jews have both Jewish and Indian ancestry. Specifically, we detect a significant recent Jewish gene flow into this community, 13 to 22 generations, with contributions from Yemenite, Sephardi, and Middle Eastern Jews in accordance with historical records. And no, they're not E1B1A. They don't have the lineage African Americans have, but I think some of them might have E1B1B. And to further combat this argument, here's a source from 1845, page 186. And it talks about the deepening of the dusky color of certain Portuguese Jews who established themselves many years ago on the Malabar coast, and who are now so black as to be scarcely distinguishable from the Aborigines, from the indigenous Indians. So despite this 19th century author's opinions on climate and its influence on skin color, Sephardic Jews became black. They are described as originally having a dusky tone originally, so some kind of dark tone, like, again, swarthy, dark, olive, not necessarily being Bantu looking African, but being an Iberian of color. Now, regardless of what they say about climate and all that stuff making people darker, this source is attesting to them becoming as black as the people there. So when the Calcutta Review says they're as black as Negroes or whatever like that, his source is saying that they became that color. And we already know that despite what the source originally said about mixing, their genetics definitely show that they mixed. Some of that stuff goes back to Sephardic Jews and other type of Jews and Indians. So yeah, here's another source, page 134 of this source, Africa from the 16th to the 18th century. And right here, Sephardim in India wouldn't have had needed to mix specifically with native Indian women to have become black. This source right here talks about the Portuguese settling African slaves along the parts of Malabar coast. Black slaves were used as soldiers, and it says the Italian scholar Pietro della Valle talked about blacks from West and East Africa, and it says the slaves also served as bearers and escorts for the Portuguese, and African women were frequently kept as mistresses. So they wouldn't have to necessarily even sleep with the Indian women to become dark over time. They could have brought African slaves with them, as they tend to do. And here's a source right here, the African presence in Portuguese India, by Anne M. Pescatello. She talks about descendants of African slaves transferred to Malabar in the 17th and 18th centuries by so-called white Jews. Footnote is right here, it's 20. And it says the white Jews are supposedly refugees from Spanish and Portuguese persecution against the new Christians, or non-convertible Jews of 16th and 17th century. So yeah, they were documented as bringing slaves with them to Malabar, and even having black women as their mistresses. They were domestic laborers who through the centuries have maintained their position in the Malabar communities despite intermarriage with the local population, including white Jews. So when wrapping up this video, I want to make reference to a video that I did on my channel. I also split it into two parts. It's on the Black Portuguese nomenclature, on the whole name, the Black Portuguese. It's a very interesting piece of history. Oftentimes the Portuguese went to places where the inhabitants were dark people, Africa, India, even Southeast Asia. And when they mixed, or the people took on their custom and manners, the people became Black Portuguese. And to wrap up this entire video and put this whole argument to bed, I mean, this one slide that I've been showing for the last 2 years now, I mean, is sufficient. The whole argument about morphology, using sources to say somebody had a hair type, nose, lips, skin, or outward appearance, doesn't tell you anything about their lineage. You could be descended of a European and have modern appearance of quote-unquote black people today, and vice versa. You can be a white person today and have had a black ancestor, and now you don't look anything like them. So DNA is a far better means to look at paternal lineages when it comes to people. A lot of people have aversions to it, but it's far better than vague interpretations of scripture, playing with history, or reading into sources. Also, a lot of the major people who make these arguments, they're not really interested in debates or any serious dialogues or this information being challenged. I think they're just satisfied with continuing to put it forth. But me, I've moved on from these kind of arguments talking about outward appearance, and I deal more with direct lineage, DNA, or any kind of wreckage that can directly show individuals having that kind of lineage with any claims, not just Hebrew Israelite claims. So I hope you all enjoyed the video. Peace, love, and no matter what people say or do, there's going to be a lot of people that continue these arguments. After a while, you just move forward and keep going with the information. You don't have to stop for anybody. I certainly won't. So I'm just leaving this whole argument where it is. Peace and love, y'all.